April 4th, 1945. Thuringian forest on a rain-choked rail spur a few miles from Merkers Kieselbach. Sergeant Frank Kasinski walked the line with 4 men and 1 unreliable radio. By noon, the 3rd Battalion of the 358th Infantry Regiment had taken Merkers with the 90th Infantry Division pushing east, and the town still smelled of smoke from hurried fires and wet brick. By night, the forest was full of a different kind of smoke. Rumor smoke, Reichsbank reserves, a mine called Kaiseroda, vault rooms numbered like filing cabinets. Counterintelligence men had spent the day in villages and farmyards asking displaced civilians the same question in 3 different ways, as if repetition could pull truth out of frightened mouths. Where did the bank move its gold when Berlin started to crack? Frank had heard the rumors second-hand, from a corporal who had escorted a suspected informant, from a medic who had patched a miner's hand, from a tired CIC agent who said, "If you see a rail car with lead seals, you don't touch it like a souvenir." Frank hadn't been sent to hunt treasure. He had been sent to clear a spur and make sure no one was waiting on it. The rain made everything sound farther away. The radio in Private Green's hands made everything feel closer and more dangerous, because it kept coughing up half messages and then dying. They found the locomotive the way you found a body, too still to be an accident. Armored, squat, paint slick with water, steam long gone, sitting under the pines as if it had rolled off the map. Frank swept his light over the wheels, the coupler, the brake line, and the crude patch of paint where an eagle insignia had been covered without being erased. Somebody had wanted to hide the identity without wasting time. Frank told Walsh to hold the trees, Holt to stay with him, Ramsey to keep eyes open, and Green to keep the handset ready. None of them loved the orders. They obeyed anyway because disobedience in the dark was how you got killed without a witness. On the first freight car, a lead seal hung from the latch, flattened hard, stamped with German letters and a clean set of numbers. Frank told Green to write the numbers down, then told him to write them again on a separate page, because wet paper tore and memories lied. Holt's hand drifted toward the latch as if the seal were an insult. Frank slapped Holt's knuckles away and said low, "Not yet." Holt swallowed his anger and stepped back. But the look he gave Frank said the night had already found its first private enemy. Frank moved to the passenger coach. The lock had been forced in a hurry. The scratches were fresh and sharp enough to catch his glove. He opened the door a few inches and caught the smell. Old smoke, cold sweat, and blood that had cooled. He pushed the door wider and aimed his flashlight down the aisle. Men in grey civilian coats sat in a neat row, hands on knees, heads bowed as if dozing. The light caught the holes at their temples. 1 per man, close and precise. No struggle, no panic. Somebody had executed them like they were balancing a ledger. Frank stepped inside long enough to check pockets without disturbing bodies. He found a wallet with a Reichsbank identification card, a stamp, a photograph, a name he didn't recognize. He found a pencil stub and a folded paper with a typed heading and no content, just an empty form meant to be filled. He found, tucked inside one coat, a rail waybill fragment damp at the edges. A dateline was still legible, November 2nd, 45, a place name Berlin. Another, Kaiseroda. The paper was incomplete, torn at the bottom. But it made the rumors feel less like fog and more like a trail. Frank backed out and shut the door again, sealing the dead clerks in their calm. The train stopped being a rumor and became a crime scene with paperwork. "Nobody touches anything," he said. "Nobody moves anything." Ramsey stared at the coach door as if it might breathe. Walsh didn't stare at all. He watched the ground, watching for tracks. Green tried the radio. Static, then a voice that broke apart. "Confirm? First?" The words were too few to count as an order, but they were enough to tell Frank that higher headquarters cared about what this was, and cared about controlling the story of it. Frank chose the next step because leaving the seals intact would only delay the inevitable. He set his pry bar on the freight car latch and leaned. Metal shrieked, The lead seal snapped, and Frank caught the flattened circle before it fell into mud. He slid it into his pocket. Holt heard the snap and smiled like a man hearing a safe open. Inside there were burlap sacks stacked with the discipline of a depot and wooden crates strapped in steel. Stencils ran in clean lines. Frank made his beam hold still long enough to read Kaiseroda. Below it, Raum 8, Room 8, an address, a filing term, the kind of label you put on something you expect to retrieve later. Holt reached for a sack again, this time with the confidence of a man who believed the war had ended for him personally. Frank pushed him off with an elbow and cut the burlap himself. His hand met paper bands and the sharp edges of currency. Reichsmarks bundled thick. He opened another sack and found foreign notes mixed in, paper from other countries that had once been held as reserves, now reduced to weight. He opened a crate and found gold bars stacked like bricks, dull in the weak light, stamped with numbers and marks that looked official enough to outlive the men who carried them. The weight of one bar pulled at his wrists when he lifted it. Holt inhaled through his teeth. Walsh watched without blinking, like he was counting, not dreaming. Frank found silver as well, heavy and cold, and bags of coins that clinked softly when his light touched them. It wasn't the fairy tale the propaganda posters promised. It was inventory. The kind of inventory that could rebuild a state or purchase a new one. Then Frank opened a smaller box and found the other kind of gold. Rings, watches, broken chains, and dental metal. Little private pieces that had once belonged to mouths and hands. The smell in the box was dry and old, like dust trapped under floorboards. Ramsey made a strangled sound and looked away. Frank shut the box fast, as if speed could undo what he had seen. In that moment, the bars stopped feeling like wealth. They felt like evidence. Frank forced his voice steady and gave orders that were half doctrine and half survival. Green, you write down every seal number, every marking. You don't let that notebook out of your hands. Walsh, you keep the perimeter. Holt, you don't touch a thing without my say. He let his eyes sit on Holt until Holt nodded. The discipline held, barely, and Frank felt the price of it in the air. When you stand between men and what they believe they've earned, they start measuring you like an obstacle. Green worked the dial again and caught a clearer fragment. G2, Bad Salzungen, Team 404G. Then the signal died. Frank didn't need the rest. Military intelligence had a tag for this story, and they were close enough to want it before the sun. He looked at the stencils again. Room 8. And he understood the train wasn't a mistake. It was a piece of the Merkers puzzle that had slipped, jammed, and now sat here waiting to be claimed. The first shot came from the trees. One crack, then silence. Frank was copying seal numbers into Green's notebook when it happened. He stepped out into rain with Ramsey at his shoulder and Walsh's silhouette near the tree line. The forest gave them no target, only fresh mud prints leading away from the spur and a cigarette butt ground into the soil. American tobacco, recent. Somebody had been here early. Somebody had waited. Frank pocketed the butt without telling anyone, because a fact like that could steady a team or blow it apart depending on who heard it first. When he returned, Holt stood too close to the open crate. Frank told him to open his jacket. Holt hesitated, then did it. A gold bar slid out and hit the wooden floor with a soft thud that sounded louder than the earlier gunshot. Frank picked it up and set it back where it belonged. He didn't lecture, he didn't threaten. He simply looked at Holt until Holt looked away. The theft attempt changed the night anyway. It meant the treasure was already inside their uniforms, and it meant Holt would not forgive the humiliation. Ramsey wouldn't stop talking. He talked about the ring box. He talked about how this wasn't a battlefield souvenir. He said they should report it now, untouched, before morning made them criminals. Holt sneered that morning would make them nobodies again. Walsh said nothing, and the silence felt like support. Frank tried to keep his words plain. He told Ramsey that reporting without control wasn't virtue. It was surrender. He told Holt that pocketing a bar wasn't courage. It was stupidity. He could see neither speech landed. The men weren't listening to him. They were listening to the gold. An hour before midnight, something moved under the locomotive's shadow. Frank swung his rifle down and shouted for hands. A German officer rose from a narrow maintenance cavity, palms up, face cut, eyes too calm. He introduced himself as Heinz. He did not plead. He watched Frank like Frank was paperwork. Frank searched him, took a pistol with one round, and dragged him into the freight car. He demanded to know about the dead clerks. Heinz said they were Reichsbank men, and they had been cleaned because clerks talked when they were frightened. Frank demanded to know why the train was on a forest spur. Heinz said fuel had run short, but fuel was never the whole reason at the end of a war. Frank held up the torn waybill fragment he had found in the coach and watched Heinz's eyes react to it. Frank pointed his light at the stencils, Kaiseroda, room 8, and asked what they meant. Heinz's eyes flicked toward the words. Frank pressed. Heinz answered carefully, as if reciting something he'd been forced to memorize. February 11th, Heinz said. Rail transfer, from Berlin. He swallowed once. To Kaiseroda, room 8. Frank's jaw tightened. The date on the fragment matched the date in Heinz's mouth. A coincidence would have been easier. Heinz kept talking because Frank's questions gave him no safe place to stop. He said there had been another rail arrival on March 18th. Special valuables. And the contempt in his voice matched the ring box Frank had shut too fast. Frank understood the shape of it. Not just bullion, but the stripped metal of people, gathered in boxes, labeled, stacked, and filed like it was all normal. Heinz offered a plan. There was an abandoned shaft nearby, he said, and a handcar on the spur. They could move a small portion of the bars before morning, just enough to buy new names. Holt leaned forward like hunger had pulled him by the throat. Frank said no. Heinz smiled anyway, and said he wasn't really bargaining with gold. There are papers, Heinz said. Lists. He said names were worth more than bars now. Names of men who had paid to be on the right side of the ending. Names that could be used as leverage in a post-war Germany that didn't know which flag would hang over which office. Frank asked where the lists were. Heinz nodded toward the engine. Where it stays dry, he said. Near heat. Green tried the radio again. A voice came through long enough to sound official and tired. It mentioned G2, and it mentioned Bad Salzungen, and it mentioned Team 4, O4G by name. It said any Reichsbank-related property would be secured, inventoried, and handed to authorized personnel at first light. Then it added a boundary disguised as advice. Keep it quiet. Confirm first. The message hit Holt like an insult. It hit Ramsey like a verdict. It hit Frank like a warning that the army had already decided how this would be handled, and that the handling might include burying complications. Frank could almost see the paperwork arriving with the sunrise, flattening everything into tidy paragraphs. Ramsey broke after midnight. Frank caught him staring at Green's notebook, then at the trees, as if he were measuring the distance to the nearest headquarters desk where he could throw his confession. Frank grabbed his sleeve. Ramsey jerked free and stumbled toward the door. Frank slammed him against the wall hard enough to knock the breath out of him and told him to stay put. Frank hated himself for it, but he could not afford a running mouth in a night that was turning into a quiet massacre. A scuffle sounded near the locomotive, muffled by steel. Frank ran and found only mud smears and a thin line of blood leading under the engine. When he turned back, Walsh and Holt were standing too close together, and Heinz sat bound and watched them all, like he had seen the same scene in other uniforms. Frank realized the forest was no longer their main threat. The threat was the decisions being made inside a radius of 20 feet. Frank gathered the men in the freight car, where he could see their hands. He counted. One man was missing,
the rifleman Walsh had sent to check the ditch line earlier. Walsh claimed the man had been sent back. Holt said he never came. Green said he had been writing. Ramsey stayed silent, eyes huge, trying to make himself small enough to be ignored. Frank took Walsh and went to the ditch line because he didn't trust Walsh alone. They found the missing man face down by a fallen log, throat cut clean, pockets turned out, rifle gone. Frank pulled the dog tags and stared at the wound. It wasn't a panicked slash. It was a practiced cut, done by somebody who didn't want noise. Frank told Walsh to carry the tags back, and he watched Walsh's hands the whole way as if hands could confess. Back at the train, Green returned from the radio attempt with his notebook clutched to his chest. He said someone had stopped him in the fog, pressed a pistol into his ribs, and told him to go back. Green couldn't describe the face. He could describe the voice. "American," he said. Frank flipped through the notebook under his flashlight. The seal numbers were there. The stencils were there. The list of crates was there. Then he found a page ripped out near the back, jagged and wet. Green swore he hadn't torn it. Frank believed him. A missing page meant someone had started editing what would exist after dawn. It meant the story was already being written while Frank was still bleeding in it. Ramsey reappeared near the ditch, shaken and bruised. He sobbed that a voice in the fog had called him by name and promised to make everything look German. He said the voice knew details only someone in uniform would know, names, ranks, the way they had set the perimeter. Frank dragged him back and locked him in the freight car because he couldn't protect him any other way. The lock turned the car into a cage, and Frank could feel the air thicken with panic behind the door. Heinz died before Frank could squeeze another sentence out of him. Frank heard movement by the wheel assembly and arrived to find Heinz slumped in the mud, throat opened in the same clean line as the dead rifleman's. Walsh stood over him, breathing hard. Holt hovered, eyes wide. "Walsh," said Heinz, tried to escape. "Holt," said Heinz, grabbed for a weapon. Frank looked at the blood and knew Heinz had been dragged, not chased. Now the only voice that could connect February 11th to room 8 to paper in the engine was dead. Frank wanted to accuse Walsh. He wanted to accuse Holt. He wanted to accuse the rain. He did none of it because accusation without proof was just another way to die. He took Green, Walsh, and Holt toward the boiler compartment because the trail had narrowed to one place, where paper could stay dry and where a fuse could turn a train into a story. The engine compartment smelled of old coal and oil. Frank's flashlight caught fresh mud on the metal floor, then a maintenance hatch with bolts that had been loosened recently. He knelt, pulled the panel, and found a narrow cavity kept unnaturally dry. Inside sat a packet wrapped in oilcloth, the kind of wrapping you used when you expected to hide something through a winter. Behind him, Walsh said, "Frank, step away." Frank turned slowly. Walsh held his rifle steady. Holt stood behind Walsh, breathing fast, eyes on the oilcloth like it was food. Green stared at Walsh as if trying to recognize him. Walsh slid a cloth band up his sleeve. MP, it read. Military Police. Frank knew in the same instant that the cloth itself didn't matter. What mattered was what it could buy in a room full of men who trusted symbols. An MP armband could make witnesses hesitate. It could make an operation look legitimate. It could make a clean report out of a dirty night. "You're not MP," Green said, voice thin. Walsh didn't look at him. "It's enough," Walsh said. "It only has to be enough until morning." He kept his rifle trained on Frank and spoke as if reciting an instruction sheet. Frank caught words like secured,
authorized, and handled by the right people. It wasn't a confession of greed. It was a confession of procedure. Frank understood then that Holt's hunger had been useful cover. Walsh wasn't here for a bar in a jacket pocket. Walsh was here to make sure the paper never walked into daylight attached to the wrong mouth. Holt looked from Walsh to Frank, waiting to see which man would give him permission to be the version of himself the night demanded. Frank lunged for the oilcloth packet anyway, because if he could see it, he could at least know what he was dying for. Walsh fired. The bullet sparked off iron, and the report rang in the compartment like a hammer on an anvil. Frank grabbed the packet and rolled. Holt slammed into him, trying to pry it away. Green reached for Holt and got thrown aside into a pipe with a hollow clang. Walsh's free hand went to a shelf and came back holding fuse wire and a small satchel of charges, enough to shatter steel if placed right, enough to turn bodies into fragments the rain could wash away. Frank saw it and felt his chest go cold. Walsh wasn't going to win by killing Frank alone. Walsh was going to erase the scene, turn their bodies into smoke and metal, and a simple cause of death. Frank jammed his shoulder into Walsh and knocked the satchel loose. The fuse wire slid into a puddle of oil and water, soaking and tangling. Holt punched Frank in the ribs, and Frank tasted blood, but he kept the packet clutched to his chest long enough to tear it open. Paper slid out, typed lines in the columns, a heading with Reichsbank and Kaiseroda, and the word Raum again. Names followed, some German, some abbreviated, some that might have been codes. Frank caught only a glimpse before Holt's fingers tore at the sheets, trying to grab a piece the way a drowning man grabbed air. It was enough. The paper existed. It belonged to the same system that stamped lead seals and labeled sacks for room 8. It was the kind of thing that could turn a recovery into a scandal. And scandals were not how armies liked to end wars, especially with occupation lines being discussed and reputations already being positioned for the peace. Frank shoved the papers back into the cavity and slammed the panel shut. He chose to hide it rather than hold it, because holding it would only end with it being taken. Walsh shoved him hard. Frank swung the rifle butt into Holt's jaw, and Holt went down against the boiler wall, stunned and blinking. Walsh raised his rifle again with the patient certainty of a man who had already decided which version of the night would survive. Frank tore the MP armband off Walsh's sleeve and ripped it. Walsh's face tightened. "That won't save you," Walsh said. Frank didn't answer. He moved first, grabbing Walsh's wrist as Walsh reached for his pistol, forcing the muzzle away. The gun fired. The round punched into iron. A hiss of residual steam screamed out of a seam and burned Frank's forearm through cloth. He bit down on the pain and kept his body between Walsh and the hatch. Then the rails began to vibrate. A low rumble built in the distance. Tracked vehicles, Shermans. Dawn bringing witnesses, and witnesses bringing the kind of authority Walsh couldn't manufacture with cloth. Walsh hesitated. In that hesitation, Frank understood the new game. With infantry arriving, Walsh didn't need to kill Frank in the boiler room. Walsh only needed to speak first and hand the morning a story that fit the army's appetite for order. Walsh backed out into the rain and shouted, "Contact, Germans, saboteurs!" as if naming Germans could erase American hands. Frank followed, blood at his lip, burn on his arm, and saw the first soldiers splash into the Spur with rifles up. A lieutenant demanded what happened. Walsh answered smoothly, "Ambush, fleeing SS, a rigged train, chaos in the dark." Holt groaned on the floor and didn't contradict. Green tried to speak and got told to shut up and keep his hands visible.
Frank opened his mouth and felt the lieutenant's suspicion land on him like a weight, because Frank looked like the kind of man who had fought in the dark and then lived. Men who weren't infantry arrived soon after. Clipboards, gloves, the posture of counterintelligence. One of them stared at the stencils, Kaiseroda, room 8, like he had been expecting exactly those words. Another asked Frank for the seal numbers. Frank gave them slowly, forcing his memory to become paper. He reported Heinz's dates, February 11th and March 18th, and the missing notebook page. The officer wrote without expression, and Frank could tell what would be preserved and what would be sanded down. Frank realized that in the end, the war didn't just run on fuel and ammunition. It ran on forms. A senior man walked to the locomotive, examined the boiler hatch, and ordered it sealed pending further review. A new lead seal was crimped onto the latch with an official stamp. Frank watched the circle flatten under the tool, clean and final. Whatever was behind that panel now belonged to custody, not to truth. Frank could already hear the phrase that would follow: classified, sensitive, under investigation. The treasure moved fast after that. Trucks loaded sacks of currency and crates of bars, as if the convoy had been planned already. Frank saw Frankfurt penciled on a crate in English and felt his stomach turn. It meant the destination had been waiting for the discovery. It meant there was a machine behind this night. And the machine didn't need his version. Late in the morning, Frank was handed a secrecy statement. The language was calm. Sensitive property, ongoing investigation, unauthorized disclosure punishable. He signed because refusing would make him the problem, and problems were what men like Walsh existed to remove. After he signed, nobody asked him anything that might create new answers. A man in a clean jacket told him he would be reassigned. Another told him he would say nothing about the rail fine to anyone who hadn't already been cleared to hear it. Frank understood the warning for what it was. Not discipline, but erasure. Before he was marched back toward Merkers, Frank returned to the freight car on the pretense of checking for stray evidence. He pulled the broken lead seal he had caught earlier from his pocket and rubbed the stamped numbers clean with his thumb. It was worthless metal, lighter than a coin. He kept it anyway because it was the only piece of the night he could carry that could not be relabeled by a clerk. He listened to the trucks leaving, the way the engines sounded confident on wet ground, and he thought about the dead clerks sitting in the coach like obedient paperwork. In later months, photographers would go down into the Merkers mine and take pictures of stacked gold and cash in bright light. Officers smiling, like treasure ended the story. Frank would hear from men who liked to talk that generals had toured the mine, that the discovery had been shown to higher command like a trophy, that the right names had stood under the right lamps. Those photographs would not mention a rain-soaked Spur or a passenger coach full of executed clerks. They would not mention a missing page. They would not mention an armband ripped in a boiler room while Shermans came up the line. Frank would remember the stencils, Kaiseroda, room 8, painted on burlap as if human suffering could be filed. He would remember the dental gold, the way it made the bars look less like wealth and more like evidence. He would remember how quickly morning paperwork could bury a night of blood. In Thuringia, gold wasn't bright. In the dark, it looked like dried blood, and dawn didn't bleach it clean. Dawn just made it official,